In this video, you're in for a real treat, so pat yourself on the back that you decided to watch this video before going on to the practice questions, or even if you don't go on to the practice questions. This information that I'm going to present really consolidates the procedural elements associated with the material in the chapter, and more importantly, it will really help you solve problems that are relevant to testing the differences between three or more means. So I'm going to guide you through the steps that I follow when I go through the challenge of evaluating whether the null hypothesis is true or not, and I've got three or more means. So the first step you need to consider is you need to check the dependent variable is scored continuously. You have to double check that. You have to make sure that it's measured on an interval ratio scale. If you don't remember what that is, you'll have to go to the chapter where I described that earlier in the textbook. Basically, it's a continuously scored measure that you have to identify. Now, I mentioned something here foreshadowing information in the chapter relevant to nonparametric statistics. Regular tests of the difference between means can be used on ordinal scale data so long as you have 5 points. So think of a Likert scale where people are asked to respond to a series of items from strongly disagree to strongly agree with a neutral point somewhere in the middle. That can be a 5-point Likert scale. It's ordinal in nature. Anova and the multiple comparison procedures tend to work on those data. That's a general statement. It is a little more complicated than that. So after I'm satisfied that the dependent variable is measured on a scale that's sufficiently continuous and informative for a one-way between subjects Anova or one of the multiple comparison procedures, I check the number of groups. And I check that the groups are in fact nominal in nature. So there's no order associated with the categories. And so these could be treatment conditions, or sometimes there can be some level of order associated with it, but you still want to do the Anova on the data. The main thing is you want to see that your data are grouped in some way, and they're probably pretty close to nominal scale, if not totally nominal scale. The next issue I address is, are there three groups? If there are three groups, the protected Fisher's LSD is definitely an attractive alternative. But if there are four groups, it's not in the mix anymore. Now I'm thinking I probably will have to do a Tukey-Kramer HST, but I do have to keep in mind that it's a single-step procedure, which means that I don't have to do a one-way between subjects Anova first. I can go straight to the Tukey-Kramer and do all the multiple comparisons. I'll be protected, and my family-wise error rate won't increase. Now, if I want to squeeze out some extra power from the analysis and also maintain the family-wise error rate at 0.05, I would consider doing the Fisher-Hayter multiple comparison procedure, but you do have to do some handwork there because I'm not familiar with any programs that actually do the Fisher-Hayter multiple comparison procedure. Certainly SPSS doesn't do it, and other programs I know do not do it. There could be one out there that does. I'm sure someone will let me know once if that's true. And good on that program for doing that because the Fisher-Hayter is really a powerful procedure. It squeezes out a bit more power than the Tukey-Kramer. And it's a two-step procedure, so you need a significant Anova first before you go on to do the Fisher-Hayter comparisons. Now, once I've determined the number of groups and my alternatives from there, I'll look at the data to determine whether they're sufficiently normally distributed. And what you have to remember, well, at least what I remember, is I use an absolute skew of 2 and 9, kurtosis of 9, as the maximum to go. So anything beyond that, I definitely get concerned about inflating the type 1 error rate. And you have to actually look at the data, each group separately. You can't just look at the whole dependent variable across all three groups in one histogram and one estimate of skew. You need to examine the distributions individually for each group. And I've shown you how to do that in a fairly efficient way by splitting the groups in SPSS at least. Now, this is also related to outliers. I would look for outliers at the same time that I'm looking for skew. If you have outliers, you'll probably have an unacceptably large amount of skew, and you'll recall that I use, as a general principle, I'll use the interquartile range multiplier of 3.0, which is an asterisk in SPSS when you create the box and whisker plot, and you get that denoted very easily for you. Now, if you really want to be the most accurate, you could use a multiplier of 2.2, but you're going to have to do the work by hand. Now, if the data are sufficiently normally distributed, and I've identified and dealt with outliers if I had to using Windsorizing techniques, then I could use a regular Anova framework. And what I mean by that is the regular asymptotic normal distribution theory statistics that are available in programs like SPSS, without having to click any extra buttons. This is just a regular Anova framework that you can use if your data are less skewed than less than 2 and kurtosis less than 9 and you don't have any outliers. But if you do have skewness greater than 2 and or kurtosis greater than 9 and or you have outliers in your data and you don't want to Winsorize them for whatever reason, then you have the option of using bootstrapping. And so that's something I'll consider doing if I am in that situation, because it doesn't assume any level of normality. So the final step here, in terms of the basic procedures, is that I'll look for homogeneity of variance. And I'll use the Levene's test of homogeneity of variance for that. And you'll recall that if the assumption is satisfied, the homogeneity of variance assumption, then the p-value for that test will be greater than 0.05. So that's a separate statistical analysis. And it's one of those rare cases where you actually, quote unquote, want to see a p-value greater than 0.05. If it's less than 0.05, then it means that the variances across the groups are likely to be unequal. And so if they are unequal, then I am not terrified by that consequence, because I can actually use the Welch's F-test or the Brown-Forsyth F-test, because they do not assume any level of homogeneity of variance and they don't assume any level of equality of sample size. It's a great, fantastic statistic. And I mentioned in the textbook, why don't we just use this one every time? Well, maybe in 100 years' time, people will actually get on board, even though these statistics are old. I encourage you to consider using them if you like. If the assumption of homogeneity of variance is not satisfied, and you do a Welch's F-test Brown-Forsyth, you're kind of stuck, because you need to follow up with multiple comparisons if the null hypothesis is rejected. And the Games-Howell is a very attractive multiple comparison procedure, and it's a single-step procedure, so you don't even need to test the omnibus hypothesis first. You don't even need the Welch's F-test or Brown-Forsyth. You can just go to the Games-Howell straight off, and it doesn't assume any level of homogeneity of variance or any level of sample size equality. And I also note that you can even use the Games-Howell in the bootstrapping framework. So if you use Games-Howell as bootstrapping, you're pretty much protected in every case, because it doesn't assume any level of normality, it doesn't assume any sample size equality, it doesn't assume any homogeneity of variance, and it doesn't even need an Anova to be significant first, because it's a single-step procedure. So it's really the best of all possible worlds in a sense. There might be some multiple comparison procedures out there that are similar to the Games-Howell, that are a little bit better because they have a little bit more power, but my hunch is there isn't very much of a difference. And so I'm going to finish this video by posing the question, why don't we just always do the Games-Howell single-step multiple comparison procedure when we have 3 or more means, and we just use bootstrapping no matter what, because bootstrapping works when you have data that are normally distributed. And the Games-Howell procedure works when you have unequal sample sizes and you have unequal variances. It works every time. And it works if you have equal variances. And it works if you have equal sample size. And the Games-Howell procedure works if you have normally distributed data. It just works in every case. So there might be a day where people are just doing the Games-Howell when they have a one-way between group subjects design analysis they need to do.